Sir, can you explain why you're stopped here? Do you have identification?
Yes, I do. May I ask the reason for the stop?
Are you refusing to provide verification right now?
No, I'm cooperating. My credentials are here. Please take a look.
Have you ever stopped to consider how quickly a single unchecked assumption can shatter a life? We walk through our days trusting the systems designed to protect us, believing that doing the right thing, playing by the rules, and wearing the right uniform provides a shield against injustice. But what happens when the very people entrusted with upholding the law are blinded by their own deeply rooted biases? Before we dive into today's story, take a second and let me know in the comments. What city or state are you watching from right now? We have a truly global community here, and I always love seeing where you are tuning in from. If you believe that going about your daily life and grabbing lunch with your kid shouldn't subject anyone to baseless suspicion, go ahead and hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Today's story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always visible on the surface, and sometimes the most profound justice is served by those the system entirely underestimated. The afternoon sun was beating down on the Northfield Community Sports Complex, casting long golden shadows across the freshly cut grass. Michael, a 42-year-old father of two, was wrapping up a perfect Saturday. He had just finished watching his 6-year-old son, Ezekiel, score his first goal of the season. Michael was wearing a faded vintage football tee, comfortable denim, and a pair of worn-in sneakers. He looked like any other exhausted but immensely proud suburban dad navigating weekend chores. But beneath that casual exterior was a man of intense discipline. For more than a decade, Michael had served his city as a sworn police officer, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant. He commanded a dedicated task force, managed high-stakes operations, and had built a reputation for unshakable integrity. As Ezekiel scrambled into the passenger side of their late-model pickup truck, his cleats still caked in mud, he looked over with those briny, hopeful eyes that only a 6-year-old can muster. He asked if they could grab a quick burger and a milkshake to celebrate the win. Michael glanced at the dashboard clock. It was 4:15. He had promised his wife, Sarah, that they would be back at the house by 4:30 to set up the living room for their weekly family movie night. Calculating the distance to the nearest drive-thru, he smiled, ruffled his son's hair, and pulled out of the lot, completely unaware that his every move was being scrutinized. Across the street, idling in the suffocating heat of an unmarked government vehicle, sat Derek, a federal immigration agent with nearly a decade of field experience. Derek fancied himself a man of exceptional intuition. He frequently bragged to his junior partners, Brian and Kyle, that he possessed an inherent radar for identifying individuals who didn't belong. In reality, Derek's so-called instinct was nothing more than a toxic cocktail of arrogance and unchecked prejudice. As Michael's truck rolled past, Derek's eyes locked onto the vehicle. He saw a successful minority man driving a pristine truck in an affluent neighborhood, and his mind immediately jumped to completely baseless conclusions. He didn't see a father treating his son after a soccer game. He saw an anomaly that his flawed worldview simply could not process. Without a word, Derek shifted the SUV into drive, signaling his partners that they were going on the hunt. Michael drove flawlessly, signaling well in advance, maintaining the exact speed limit, and coming to a gentle halt in the drive-through lane of a local fast food restaurant. The location was relatively quiet. Only one sedan sat idling ahead of them at the speaker box. Ezekiel was practically bouncing in his seat, excitedly rehearsing his order out loud. Michael laughed, leaning over to adjust the air conditioning vents, feeling a profound sense of peace. That peace was violently shattered the moment Derek's heavy SUV aggressively boxed the pickup truck in from behind, its front bumper mere inches from Michael's tailgate. The doors of the government vehicle flew open simultaneously. Derek, Brian, and Kyle stepped out onto the blistering asphalt, their tactical vests catching the harsh afternoon light. They moved with predatory coordination, executing a standard triangle containment maneuver. Derek approached the driver's side, Brian flanked the rear, and Kyle positioned himself directly outside the passenger window, looming over a suddenly terrified Ezekiel. Michael's peripheral vision caught the tactical gear, and his internal alarms immediately went off. 11 years of law enforcement training kicked in, overriding his initial confusion. He kept his hands entirely visible, gripping the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. Derek arrived at the window, his posture dripping with unwarranted authority, and aggressively demanded to see immediate proof of legal residency. He offered no lawful justification for the stop, no citation of reasonable suspicion, just a harsh, localized demand born of pure bias. Michael kept his voice intentionally measured, projecting the calm, authoritative tone he used to de-escalate volatile suspects on the streets. He quietly challenged their legal basis for the detainment, acutely aware that his frightened 6-year-old was sitting just 3 feet away. Derek scoffed, leaning closer, his demeanor making it entirely clear that compliance was not a request. Moving with deliberate, telegraphed slowness to ensure his actions couldn't be misinterpreted as a threat, Michael reached into his center console. He bypassed his civilian wallet entirely. Instead, he withdrew his official department-issued leather credential case. Flipping it open, the heavy gold lieutenant's shield caught the sunlight, sitting prominently next to his official municipal identification card. Michael clearly stated his rank, his department, and his years of active service. Derek stared at the badge. For a fleeting second, confusion washed over his features, quickly replaced by a deeply entrenched, stubborn denial. He grabbed the wallet, examining the credentials with exaggerated skepticism, passing them back to his partners. They exchanged a series of muted, knowing glances. Whatever narrative they had constructed in their minds about Michael, they were entirely unwilling to let it go. Finally, Derek tossed the leather case back through the open window with a dismissive wave. He mumbled a vague, insincere acknowledgement, explicitly telling Michael that he was cleared and free to leave. Derek turned on his heel, walking back toward the SUV. Brian and Kyle followed suit. Inside the truck, Michael let out a slow, controlled breath. The tension began to drain from his shoulders. Ezekiel whispered, asking if the scary men were gone. Michael forced a reassuring smile, promising his son that everything was perfectly fine, that it was just a simple misunderstanding. But outside the truck, a sinister choreography was unfolding. Having retreated about 15 feet, all 3 agents suddenly stopped in their tracks. In perfect, terrifying synchronization, they all reached to the center of their tactical vests. The glowing red indicator lights on their department-issued body cameras blinked and immediately went dark. The digital eyes that held them accountable were deliberately blinded. They pivoted as one unit and sprinted back toward the pickup truck. The feigned professionalism had evaporated, replaced by raw, unjustified aggression. Before Michael could even register the escalation, his driver's side door was violently yanked open. Derek and Brian grabbed him by the arms, forcefully ripping him out of the driver's seat and dragging him onto the hot asphalt. Michael shouted, demanding to know what they were doing, clearly reiterating his status as a sworn officer of the law and citing his constitutional protections against unlawful seizure. His words fell on entirely deaf ears. They slammed him against the side of the truck, kicking his legs apart. Cold steel handcuffs were slapped onto his wrists. The ratchets tightened so severely, they instantly cut off circulation. As they pinned him down, the agents began spewing venomous, deeply biased accusations. They told him his badge had to be fake, that a man of his demographic couldn't possibly earn that rank, and that his supposed authority was completely worthless out here on the street. But the physical pain of the brutal arrest was nothing compared to the sheer agony of what was happening inside the vehicle. Ezekiel was screaming. The little boy had unbuckled his seatbelt and was pressing his tear-streaked face against the glass, his tiny fists pounding frantically as he watched his hero being treated like a violent criminal. Michael tried desperately to turn his head, shouting over the chaos for Ezekiel to lock the doors and stay inside. but a heavy hand shoved his face back against the metal. The agents dragged Michael toward their SUV, throwing him roughly into the cramped back seat. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. As the vehicle sped away, Michael twisted his body, peering through the rear window. The last image he saw was his beloved pickup truck sitting abandoned in the drive-through lane, his traumatized 6-year-old son completely alone inside it. The drive to the processing center was a blur of calculated disorientation. They took winding back roads, avoiding major highways, eventually pulling into a bleak, unmarked industrial compound surrounded by razor wire. Inside, the fluorescent lighting buzzed with a sickening hum. Michael was dragged before a deeply apathetic intake officer. The agents began weaving a completely fabricated narrative, claiming Michael had been acting suspiciously, resisting commands, and failing to provide verifiable identification. Michael demanded his legally mandated phone call. He cited specific statutes, demanded they contact his precinct captain to verify his identity, and begged them to send a local unit to the restaurant to secure his abandoned child. The intake officer simply stared right through him, methodically logging Michael's personal effects, his phone, his wallet, his keys, before guards marched him down a long, echoing corridor and shoved him into a cramped, freezing holding cell. The heavy steel door slammed shut, plunging Michael into isolation. For the first hour, panic threatened to entirely consume him. The thought of Ezekiel crying alone in a hot car was a physical weight on his chest. But as the minutes ticked by, that frantic paternal terror slowly crystallized into something incredibly dangerous to the men who had put him there: cold, calculated, legal precision. You see, there was a crucial detail about Michael that none of his colleagues at the precinct even knew. For the past 5 years, he had been quietly sacrificing his evenings and weekends, exhausting himself studying late into the night. Michael wasn't just a veteran police lieutenant. He was secretly a fully qualified legal scholar who had just passed the state bar exam. Sitting on that rigid steel bench, nursing his bruised wrists, Michael didn't just see his situation as a victim, he saw it as an attorney. His mind became a steel trap, methodically cataloging every single civil rights violation he had just endured. The initial stop without a shred of reasonable suspicion. The blatant disregard of presented, valid credentials. The undeniable, premeditated conspiracy of shutting off the body cameras. The excessive use of force under the color of law. The severe emotional distress inflicted upon a minor. The unlawful detention. Piece by piece, in the quiet darkness of that cell, Michael began building the foundation of a lawsuit that would eventually scorch the earth beneath his captors. Miles away, inside their quiet suburban home, Sarah was staring at her phone, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. It was well past 4:30. Michael was notoriously punctual, a trait beaten into him by years of police shift work. Sarah, an elite systems architect for a major financial firm, lived her life by data and redundancies. A few years prior, to help manage their busy schedules, she had installed a highly accurate military-grade GPS tracking application on all their family devices. Just as she was about to call him, her screen lit up with an unfamiliar local number. She answered, and her heart nearly stopped. It was the manager of the fast food restaurant. The woman sounded completely frantic, explaining that a little boy was sitting alone in a truck in their parking lot, sobbing hysterically, saying bad men had stolen his father. Ezekiel had somehow remembered Sarah's cell number through his panic. Sarah didn't hesitate. She barked an order to her teenage son to lock the doors, grabbed her keys, and practically flew to the restaurant. When she arrived, Ezekiel launched himself into her arms, shaking violently, repeating the terrifying details of the arrest. Sarah held him tight, her maternal instincts warring with a sudden, icy rage. After securing her son in the back seat of her car, she pulled out her phone and opened the tracking network. She located Michael's device. It was stationary, pinned to an obscure address in a distant industrial park. A quick reverse search of the coordinates confirmed her worst nightmare. It was an unlisted federal immigration detention center. Sarah possessed a brilliant, analytical mind. She knew that charging in there as an angry spouse would accomplish nothing. Instead, she bypassed the standard emergency lines and directly dialed the personal cell phone of Michael's precinct commander, Captain Elena Ramirez. When Ramirez answered, Sarah delivered the facts with surgical precision: the location, the nature of the facility, the abandonment of a child, and the complete impossibility of the situation. Ramirez, a hardened, no-nonsense veteran of local law enforcement, immediately recognized the gravity of the crisis. She didn't bother changing out of her uniform. She threw on her duty jacket, heavily adorned with the gold brass of her rank, and sped toward the industrial park. When Captain Ramirez stormed through the doors of the processing facility, the atmosphere instantly changed. She bypassed the standard waiting area and approached the bulletproof glass, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. When the intake officer tried to deflect her, claiming they had no record of a Michael fitting that description, Ramirez leaned into the glass. In a voice that was barely more than a whisper, but carried the weight of a sledgehammer, she began listing the catastrophic consequences of their actions. She promised immediate Federal Bureau of Investigation involvement. She promised local news vans camped on their lawn within the hour. She explicitly outlined the felony charges associated with kidnapping a sworn municipal officer and abandoning a minor. The color drained from the intake officer's face. After a flurry of panicked, whispered phone calls to unseen superiors, the heavy steel door at the end of the hallway finally buzzed open. Michael walked out. His clothes were rumpled, his demeanor exhausted, and the deep, angry purple bruises from the cuffs were highly visible on his wrists. But when he locked eyes with his captain, his gaze was razor sharp. He didn't look broken, he looked entirely focused. The drive back to the precinct was quiet, save for Michael detailing the exact sequence of events, highlighting the synchronized camera shutdown. That night, after Ezekiel was finally asleep, exhausted from crying, Michael and Sarah sat at their kitchen table. The warm glow of the pendant lights stood in stark contrast to the dark reality of what had occurred. Michael finally revealed to Sarah the legal strategy he had formulated in the cell. Sarah's eyes narrowed with determination. She immediately went to work, utilizing her tech expertise to secure the digital footprints, location data, and communication metadata from that afternoon. The next morning, the counteroffensive began. Captain Ramirez utilized her administrative power to subpoena the security camera footage from the restaurant's drive-thru. When the video file arrived at the precinct, Michael, Sarah, and the captain watched it in complete silence. The high-definition footage was utterly damning. It captured the entire encounter perfectly, clearly showing the agents examining Michael's badge, pretending to leave, and then, in a terrifying display of premeditation, simultaneously reaching up to disable their cameras before launching their violent assault. The visual of little Ezekiel crying in the window was enough to make Ramirez slam her fist on the desk. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a deeply coordinated abuse of power. Michael retained one of the most aggressive civil rights litigators in the state, but he didn't just hand the case over, he acted as a shadow co-counsel. When they filed the massive federal lawsuit against the three agents and their agency, they didn't just ask for a staggering financial settlement, they demanded a structural teardown of the local field office's practices. The lawsuit triggered a grueling discovery phase. Armed with court orders, Michael's legal team forced the agency to hand over the internal hard drives and communication logs of Derek and his team. What they found buried deep in those digital files transformed the case from an isolated incident of bias into a massive systemic scandal. Investigators uncovered a hidden, unofficial spreadsheet maintained by Derek, sickeningly titled The Watch List. It contained the names, addresses, and vehicle descriptions of dozens of highly successful minority professionals living in the surrounding suburbs. Michael's name and license plate had been added to the list months prior. The agents had been actively profiling and hunting individuals who defied their prejudiced expectations, using their federal badges as a shield to harass citizens who had committed absolutely no crimes. When the existence of the spreadsheet and the restaurant security footage leaked to the press, the public fallout was instantaneous and explosive. The video went massively viral, dominating national news cycles for weeks. The sheer, undeniable proof of the synchronized camera blackout stripped the agents of any plausible deniability. Under crushing public and political pressure, the Department of Justice stepped in. Derek, Brian, and Kyle were stripped of their badges, immediately terminated, and subsequently indicted by a federal grand jury on multiple felony counts, including deprivation of rights under the color of law and reckless endangerment of a child. Their careers were entirely obliterated, their reputations permanently destroyed by the very arrogance that had fueled their actions. The agency, terrified of a public trial that would expose even deeper institutional rot, completely capitulated. They agreed to a historic multi-million-dollar settlement. But for Michael, the money was merely a tool. He immediately utilized the funds to establish a powerful, well-funded legal advocacy foundation dedicated entirely to providing top-tier representation for victims of unlawful profiling and unconstitutional detainment. He formally retired his police badge, traded his uniform for a tailored suit, and transitioned into his new life as a relentless civil rights attorney. The foundation forced sweeping, permanent changes within local and federal law enforcement agencies, mandating strictly audited body camera compliance, severe penalties for unauthorized deactivations, and radical overhauls of probable cause training. Years later, the trauma of that afternoon had evolved into a legacy of profound protection for others. Ezekiel grew up resilient, eventually interning at his father's foundation, turning his darkest childhood memory into a passion for justice. Michael often stood before packed lecture halls at law schools and police academies, using his own story to teach a vital lesson. True authority is never defined by intimidation or unchecked bias. The system had looked at him and seen a target, someone they assumed they could easily erase. They had no idea they were dragging a legal architect into their cell. They learned the hardest way possible that dignity cannot be handcuffed, and that when you push a man who understands the law better than those breaking it, you don't just lose your badge, you change the entire system.